This program is brought to you by Real Estimate. Get a free real estimate of your home's value today on the realestate.com.au app.
Welcome back. There were about 1,740 auctions held across the country on Saturday, returning a clearance rate of almost 64%. Sydney held about 670 auctions with a clearance rate of about 61%. There were also 1,351 private sales over the weekend in New South Wales. Melbourne held about 680 auctions with a clearance rate of 72%. There were about 1,100 private sales in Victoria. Brisbane held 63 auctions with a clearance rate of about 52%. There were 960 private sales in Queensland. Adelaide held 67 auctions with a clearance rate of about 73%. There were 237 private sales. The ACT held 65 auctions with a clearance rate of about 71%. There were also 106 private sales. Perth held 3 auctions with 1 selling. There were a further 549 private sales in WA. Darwin held 3 auctions with 2 selling. There were 19 private sales in the NT. Well, let's bring in here Anne Flaherty, Senior Economist at REA Group. And thanks for your time. Just talk us through the auctions numbers and the amount of stock that's out there on the market as we're in the middle of winter.
Well, it is good to see that clearance rates are still holding up pretty well, but we have seen a bit of a dip in the number of homes coming up for sale. So, of course, we normally see the number of properties being listed decrease over winter, but if we compare this year compared to last year, we're actually down around 9% across the country. So not as busy a period as what we were seeing pre-Easter and probably when we come to that spring season again.
What sort of traffic, though, are you seeing on the REA Group website? Are there still a lot of people interested in looking at properties?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, buyer demand is still showing very strong. And in particular, what we've seen is post 2 rate cuts, the total number of people out there looking is very high. I think that people are recognising that we are likely to see further rate cuts throughout the rest of the year as well, which could drive home values higher. So I think a lot of people are actively looking at the moment.
Yeah, obviously we've had 2 interest rate cuts already and the Reserve Bank is tipped to cut rates next month as well and possibly again later this year. I mean, how much positivity or how much of a boost is that potentially giving the property market at the moment?
Look, it has had a strong impact. And when we look at consumer sentiment, it's really quite clear that the interest rate cuts have increased that sentiment. What's also quite interesting is when you look at intent to buy, we've seen a really strong rise year on year in the total number of people who are stating that they think now is a good time to buy. People who had been holding off because they were perhaps waiting for home values to adjust in certain markets or for home price growth to slow in other markets, I think now are looking at the dynamics and saying, look, now is as good a time as any to actually get in.
Yeah, and when you talk about home values, are there any parts of the country that are doing pretty well when it comes to property price growth?
Yeah, well, we're starting to see a bit of a shift from what we were seeing last year. So if we look last year, it was really the market was dominated by Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane. Now we've seen a really strong slowdown in the rate of growth in Perth. And in contrast, Melbourne, which really was the weakest performing city over the past few years, has actually really seen a very strong pickup in growth and was actually the fastest growing capital city in May. And actually, inner Melbourne in particular has seen one of the strongest rates of growth around the country in recent months. So it's kind of interesting that we're seeing still those different dynamics across the country, but a bit of a swap in who's the outperformer.
Yeah, it's interesting with Melbourne. What do you think? What do you put it down to, the sort of recent success of Melbourne? And most of the property sales in Melbourne, is it mostly apartments that are being sold?
Look, we're seeing it across the board, both houses and units. One thing that we are seeing in Melbourne is a pretty interesting change of events where we're seeing a lot of interstate buyers looking at Melbourne's property values. Melbourne was overtaken by Perth actually in the most recent home values, which means that we're now the third cheapest city behind only Hobart and Darwin. So there's a lot of value in the Melbourne market compared to the other capitals around the country. And I think a lot of buyers are saying that this doesn't really add up if you think about the fact that Melbourne is the fastest growing city. It is the second largest city. So I think that that's driving an interest.
All right, and if we do get a few more rate cuts, what are you expecting for property price growth broadly across Australia over the rest of this year?
Look, we know that all else equal, when interest rates come down, home values generally go up. And of course, we are still seeing that population growth outpace certainly what the government was forecasting would happen. Now, that dynamic, not enough homes, strong population growth, is going to continue to support underlying property values. I think what happens in the rental market is going to have a big impact as well. I think that a lot of renters have seen astronomical increases in the rates that they're paying in recent years. And so for a lot of these people, they might be getting into a situation where suddenly the maths is looking a little bit better when it comes to home ownership versus paying those rents.
Anne Flaherty, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks.